Hello and welcome to annotating chapter 8 of Jekyll and Hyde part 2, because the chapter is so long it needed 2 parts. So let's get to it. We ended the last one on page 80 in my copy of the book, and we went halfway down the page and we're going to continue from here. So the first quote we're going to look at: "This suspense, I know, is telling upon all of you, but it is now our intention to make an end of it. Paul here and I are going to force our way into the cabinet. If all is well, my shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame." In all of this big speech here, Utterson is a heroic leader, and we can see this in the language he uses as well. He uses plural pronouns of "are" to make everyone feel united in this kind of attack against whatever is inside that cabinet. We see a lot of speeches, friends, Romans, countrymen, the speeches that persuade people the most and really bolster them up for action are the ones that use "are" and "we", a bit like High School Musical, we're all in this together. That is very, very persuasive and kind of builds that morale for them. If all is well, my shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame. Now, my shoulders are broad enough. This is kind of showing physical strength, but he's not actually talking about being physically strong within that line. What he's talking about is, if we go in all guns blazing, we get in there and we find out that Jekyll's been fine all this time and now we're all a bit embarrassed. My shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame. In other words, his emotional strength is strong enough to withstand being awkward and embarrassed. Physical strength equates to his emotional strength and reputation. So his reputation and his standing can handle it. It can handle a bit of a blow if it turns out that everything was fine. He also uses imperatives in this speech. We must, you must, the boy must, to show his command. And again, it links back to Utterson being the heroic leader. It's a very nice position to see him in. Let's go on to the next page. Paul and Utterson then go to their position, which is to go to the cabinet door. And on their way there, the wind tossed the light of the candle to and fro. So obviously, if you've got a candle and the light is sort of going back and forth, there is the not the risk, but the so it's kind of like this apprehension of candle going out and then being sort of like consumed by darkness, because it's established elsewhere in here that it's dark enough already. And the candle is clearly the small bit of light they have. So if the candle's going to go out, that's going to be a bit like, too much. So darkness, and we could say literal and metaphorical. Metaphorical in terms of like the evil sense of Hyde, and literal in terms of that they are literally going to be in the darkness. And we've also got London hummed solemnly all around. Now, a hum is a quiet sound, usually. And solemnly kind of means serious in almost a sad way. And what this does is it reminds us how far, let's push that down, they are from society and fellow humans. And there's nothing that makes you more scared than that feeling of being alone and of being isolated and being far from where the rest of humankind is. So that kind of, along with the candle and the darkness, it's all giving you the heebie-jeebies. Don't say that in your essay. Let's move down. They then listen to the cabinet door for what is inside, and there are steps that fell lightly and oddly with a certain swing, for all they went so slowly, different indeed from the heavy creaking tread of Henry Jekyll. So again, we've got the opposite between Jekyll and Hyde. So Hyde, light shows that he is small, and we've talked previously about what the smallness represents, him being underdeveloped. He's described as odd from there, and a certain swing is kind of so not stable, whereas heavy creaking tread of Jekyll would suggest that he is the opposite. He's stable, he's strong, reliable perhaps, and we have those lovely opposites there. Remember, outside reflects the inside with physiognomy. Let's go to the next page. Paul says that one time the only other noise he heard was of weeping. Utterson responds, "Weeping? How that?" Conscious of a sudden chill of horror. This is very Gothic with a capital G. Weeping like a woman or a lost soul. In fact, that's quite Gothic as well. So it's I find this hard to ascertain. Is the weeping Jekyll or is it Hyde? Because we know they change back and forth, and because no one can see it, we're not sure who it is at any point in time. If it's Jekyll weeping like a woman or a lost soul, he knows he will die. He's in despair, loss of control. Now, if it's Hyde's a very, very different character to Jekyll. And if Hyde is weeping, that's very unlike him. Perhaps it's some eventual remorse. Maybe the line between Jekyll and Hyde is blurring now that they've sort of come together. But we're going to put a question mark with that because we'll never know because of what happens next. Yeah. So I'll just pause that there. Hopefully you've got all that. Going down the page a little bit more. Then they say, "We're going to break down the door." And a voice replies, "Utterson," said the voice, "for God's sake, have mercy." Ah, that's not Jekyll's voice, it's Hyde's. This is very interesting that this is Hyde's last words. Spoiler. In the whole book. And it's, "For God's sake, have mercy." Now, you can interpret that in one of two ways. Is it blasphemous? Because in those days saying, in that colloquial sense, "Oh, for God's sake," that would be quite blasphemous. That would be anti-religion. However, there is a second interpretation. You can also say in a non-blasphemous way, "For God's sake," in terms of like the mercy of God, for the sake of God, in a very genuine sense. But it could be genuine turn to God in final moments. This would back up the hypothesis we made earlier of have the lines between Jekyll and Hyde, have they started to blur together? And does Jekyll now have a little bit of Hyde in him with being sort of against God and a bit immoral? And does Hyde have features of Jekyll within him of, "I'm willing to plead to God if it's necessary, am I going to beg for my life," essentially, which is a very, it's a very unproud thing to do. Because we would expect for Hyde's character for him to be not wanting of any help, not wanting of any mercy. He doesn't need, he's too proud for that. And pride obviously being one of the cardinal sins. And this is very much the opposite. So that's quite interesting. And then a dismal screech as of mere animal terror rang from the cabinet. Again, we've seen this time and time again. Hyde being described as an animal. We can link that to Charles Darwin. Theory of evolution. And Hyde being primal. This kind of rudimentary form of human. A dismal screech of mere animal terror. I quite like the word mere. Suggests insignificance. No one cares for it. No one cares for Hyde. Dismal. Kind of meaning awful. And screech. That's a very unpleasant sound. In total, there is a lack of pity for what we come to know as, this is his death cry, as it were, like that final noise of death. But there is no pity in this death. I then collated these words: axe, crash, bounded, blow, burst, wreck, riot. A lovely semantic field of action and violence, actually. So Paul and Utterson are like these sort of really cool, dare I say it, heroes. They are very much the knights in shining armour, that trope. I'm just going to put like knights there. They're not just these moral heroes, they're also these men of action. And it's quite nice to see Utterson in this way, that he's not just this stuffy old lawyer, using logic to win the day. He's using his brute force as well. You go, Utterson. And then after all this banging and crashing about, there is a stillness that had succeeded it. So it's like the calm after the storm, and there's also this nice sibilance here, this kind of discomfort and suspense of the silence, like, oh, this noise which helps us feel a bit better, and then, oh God, everything's quiet, and it's like very disconcerting. But then we got lots of positive imagery here. There's a quiet lamplight, a good fire glowing and chattering, the kettle singing. So we've got personification of pleasant atmosphere. Kind of juxtaposes what has happened, which could be quite disconcerting. There lay the body of a man sorely contorted and still twitching. And then after that it's called it again. So even though briefly it's referred to as a man, it's the dehumanization of Hyde. I quite like this contorted and twitching, only because it reminds me of like Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley, who is also of slightly earlier than this book, but they're kind of regarded as some of the best Victorian literature. So this book would, like, Stevenson would have read Frankenstein, like, no doubt, and it's a bit of a stretch, but this does remind me of the imagery of sort of a Frankenstein, and the message of Frankenstein was that Dr. Frankenstein, so I shouldn't say Frankenstein, I should say Frankenstein's monster. Oh God, that was nearly a mistake. Could never forgive myself for that. So Dr. Frankenstein makes this monster, and with the electricity and stuff, it sort of twitches and contorts into life, whereas this one is twitching and contorting into death. But the message of Frankenstein, and I guess of this book as well, is that man should not play God. To give and to take life, that is not something for man to decide. And in this book, Jekyll has certainly created a life in a way within himself. And how does it end? It ends with this very unpleasant death. Very nasty. Hyde dies. I've just written that there because life was quite gone. So let's move over. And Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer, and as this past student has said, it is suicide, so make sure you write that down. Now, context. It's certainly true of like the Tudor time period, and I am pretty certain that it's a belief that would have carried on into the Victorian era as well. Suicide was very anti-Christian. You would be refused a proper burial definitely in Tudor times, if they knew that you committed suicide, because God gave life, so you offend him if you cut it off. The belief is that God decides when your life ends, and through God's will, whether that's natural age or some natural disaster, that is how your life should end. And so therefore, if you take the life of another, or if you take your own life, you are deeply offending God, because only God gets to decide who lives and dies. It's not for man to decide at all. So this would be, in any case, shocking for Victorian reader. It would still have this sense of taboo around it. It's a very taboo topic. So let's go into why. A lot of people might read this and go, well, why would Hyde kill himself? But as we'll soon piece together, it's not Hyde that takes these poisonous things here to kill himself. It's Jekyll that commits that act. Hyde ran away and made sure he was not seen when he killed Sir Danvers Carew, because he feared being hung for what he did. Hyde fears death. But Jekyll is the one who decides to kill himself, because there is a loss of control to Hyde, so he kills both of them before Hyde fully takes over. Essentially, Jekyll knew that Hyde was going to just take over completely and commit more heinous crimes, so instead of allowing him to do that, Jekyll makes an ultimate sacrifice and kills both of them for the sake of essentially everyone in London. So Jekyll sacrifice and ends as a saviour in a way. So it's this very complex issue. Yes, he does something very anti-Christian by killing himself, but on the other hand, it's also a very good moral Christian act, because if he didn't do this, Hyde would be taken over completely, Jekyll would not exist anymore, and there would be more suffering inflicted by the hands of Hyde. So it is the right choice for him to make. I'm actually going to skip ahead a whole 2 pages here, so you can too, and go to this quote. One lay beside the tea things open, and Utterson was amazed to find it a copy of pious work for which Jekyll had several times expressed a great esteem, annotated in his own hand with startling blasphemies. Pious work means very religious, so do write that down. And startling blasphemies, blasphemy is anti-religious, possibly swear words, possibly saying lots of things that are anti-God. Pious work, it could very well be a Bible that's sort of been graffitied in all this obscene language. That's kind of what Stevenson wants you to imagine here. So what do we have? Before, we've talked about, is Jekyll religious or anti-religious? Automatically, because he's on the side of science, he's already, rejecting religion. But these startling blasphemies is Jekyll's full rejection of God. We've also got the tea things open. It's this kind of a symbol of British manners. And respectability, which contrasts the graffitied pious work. Utterson has a great esteem for strict, rigid religion, and Jekyll sort of rebels against it with Hyde's scribbles. So we could say, because we know from previous that their handwriting is the same, so maybe it's actually Hyde. Sorry. So Jekyll did, what's the word? Not enjoy, appreciate strict religion, and arguably it is Hyde that then gets rid of it. The dual nature of man is also evident in this quote between the pious and the blasphemies. So just go put juxtaposition. Duality of J and H. Lovely. And that's there for that. And then I talked about this in the plot summary video and said we're going to come back to that. And here we are coming back to it. They notice a cheval glass, which in other words is a mirror, into whose depths they looked at with involuntary horror, but it was so turned as to show them nothing but the rosy glow playing on the roof. And then Paul says, "This glass has seen some strange things, sir." And Utterson asks, what could Jekyll want with it? And this is a very good question. They're in a lab. Why would you need a mirror in a lab? You know, you use a mirror for getting ready. It's out of place there. So we come to ask the question, why did Jekyll need it? And of course, here is the answer. So draw an arrow from there and also from here. It's used to see if the transformations worked. When Jekyll takes the potion and vice versa, it's a physical transformation that happens. So the only way he will know if it's worked is if he looks in a mirror and be like, oh yes, I look like this man now, therefore I am this man. And then now that we know this, let's look at this line. It was so turned as to show them nothing but the rosy glow playing on the roof. In other words, the mirror is facing the ceiling. So the mirror has been turned. This suggests that the viewer was appalled, I'm going to write this here, by what they saw. You can just imagine it, can't you? They look at the mirror and like, oh, it's so awful. And then you sort of push the mirror so that it kind of tilts and looks elsewhere so that you can't physically see yourself anymore. We don't know whether it was Jekyll being repulsed by Hyde or Hyde being repulsed by Jekyll, vice versa. It's a very strange way that this all works, but in either case, they're appalled by what they saw. Then we come to the will. They find the will. But in place of the name Edward Hyde, the lawyer, with indescribable amazement, read the name of Gabriel John Utterson. Oh my gosh, it's him. Utterson is now the heir of Jekyll's estate and fortune. And Utterson's very confused. Hyde has been all these days in possession of the changed will. He has no cause to like me. He must have raged to see himself displaced, and he has not destroyed this document. But the doctor's hand and dated... In Jekyll's handwriting, it's dated at the top, showing that Jekyll was alive, and here on this very day. This now answers a lot of our questions in terms of when was Jekyll Jekyll, when was Hyde Hyde. I've ascertained that this is Jekyll's very last act before committing suicide, which meant that Hyde could then not undo the will. So, yeah, that explains that one. I hope it does anyway. Let's now move on. Nearly there. Utterson then finds the note from Jekyll saying, please read Lanyon's document first and then read mine, and then you'll find out everything that happens. And he describes himself as your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll. Oh, it's so sad. But it does show guilt and shame for what he has done. Regret as well. And of course, this idea of a confessional. It's a way of atoning for sins. Normally you do it in those rooms I think think in a church, and you go into one room and the priest is on the other side of it, and they're like, what would you like to confess? And then you confess your sins. And it's almost like this is Henry Jekyll's confession, so that he might still get into heaven, if possible. Who knows? And then the last quote, Utterson says, I will go home and read these documents by myself, but I shall be back before midnight, when we shall send for the police. I don't know, it just makes me laugh that police are not called for first. And I think I've got another reason why they're not called for. Originally we said maybe it's because the police are seen as inept, you know. This happens before the Jack the Ripper murders, where everyone was like, oh, the police are useless, and, you know, you don't get smoke without a fire, so there must have been incidents of the police being, you know, quite ineffectual before this. But maybe it's also, if they get the police involved now, everyone in town is going to know about Jekyll, and they're going to know about what happened before Utterson can even really understand what happened for himself. In other words, this avoids a scandal. There is no point involving the police until they know everything that's happened, and even then they're going to carefully weigh it up and be like, okay, is it time? So I think, you know, scandal, and again, the respectability of a Victorian gentleman, in this regard Jekyll, is held higher than, I'm going to say, safety. You know, if they weigh it up, what would be better? Calling the police to make sure this is dealt with appropriately and safely and get us out of harm's way? Or do we want to put our own lives at risk to help make sure that Jekyll stays respectable? And it's clear which one they choose. It is the respectability every single time.